All right, hey folks, so should you progress volume over the course of a block or should you keep the sets the same? Who's right? All right, so firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there is a link in the description. Now, the hot topic over the last, I would say 5 or 6 years, which has been really pushed by Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization and a few other companies from around the world, has been increasing volume totals over the week to week, and over the block. Now, I've been on that gain train as well. I've experimented with it quite heavily, and it works. It's a good approach. But as with any approach, you want to explore all the positives and the negatives and the benefits thoroughly. And over the course of time, once you've been familiarized with the concept, you can look at the pros and cons. So today, I want to actually look at some of the cons of that approach. So first of all, I want to discuss what they actually are. So let's firstly discuss static volume and kind of let's define the terms first. So what's static volume, and then we'll look at what is progressive volume. So static volume is your typical like 3x8, 3x5, 5x5, and it typically employs double progression. So week 1 might be 100 for 554, week 2 might be 100 for 555, then you put the weight up to 102 for 543. This can work well in blocks, but it can also work well in linear cycles. So this works well no matter what. This is your typical loading strategy. All right, now here is the progressive volume strategy and what that means. So focus is on the volume week to week, the total volume for the muscle group week to week, and progressing it. So what you end up with is a triple progression strategy where, let's say week 1 for an exercise, it would be 80 kilos for 6, 12, and 9. Then week 2 would be 82.5 for 14, 11, 7. You up the load, reps have dropped a little bit. And the week after, you keep the weight the same, but you go 13, 15, 13, 11, and then you add another set to 8. This type of loading structure generally works better in blocks, simply because you're going to reach an endpoint of how much volume you can cope with. So after a period of time of increasing the volume over the course of the block, there'll be a natural endpoint, and that's when you're supposed to sort of deload, recycle, and then start a new block. You might go from, say, 12 total sets to 20 total sets, and by the 20 mark, you're absolutely trashed. Now, there are a lot of positives. Yeah, there are a lot of positives to that approach. The one thing is you can establish really good intensity in the first couple of weeks, and then you can aim to push that up higher with the volume over the course of the next few weeks. So the lower volumes allow you to establish intensity. Then as you slowly bring in the higher volumes, you can keep that intensity, but just ramp the volume up. Altogether, just ramping up the signal to the body to grow. So it's a good way of doing things, but it's not without its criticism. And that's kind of what I want to explore a bit more today. So next thing is, before we move on to the criticisms, let's just quickly discuss RIR. Now, the reps in reserve concept is essentially this. You are targeting an effort gauge rather than targeting reps. So that is what stops the set. You don't just reach a target number of reps, you target effort. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit closer to train to failure than just going for a number of reps. You are targeting a specific effort level. And generally, it's not training to failure. It's training maybe 1 or 0 or what way, like usually 1 or 2 reps away from failure. That's what reps in reserve are. Now, somebody's going to say like the progressive sets workout works better with RIR, but that's not actually true if you think about it. Reps in reserve is not the defining factor in progressive versus static loading. You can use reps in reserve for static loading as well. You can do 5x5 and just always stay 1 rep away from failure. You can do that. People have been doing that for years and decades. So RIR is not the sole place for progressive volume loading. It's just simply talked about a lot in progressive loading circles, but it can be applied to static loading as well. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, because while I have talked about these types of cycles before, one of the comments that I received was that RIR works better with progressive loading, but it's just not true. Like, people have been using RIR, just not calling it RIR, for decades with static loading. So that criticism, I think, falls flat on its face if you actually think about it. Next, let's talk about the actual criticisms. So criticism 1. Now, volume progression is based over time, lengthy duration, not week-to-week progressions. So Most of the research, aside from Mike's recent piece, is really based on looking at volume progression over the course of an entire lifespan. So when you're a beginner, you need less. Typically, when you're advanced, you need more, that type of thing. It's not there. The volume progression is not based on week-to-week linear progressions. That's not what we've been studying. So we can't say, I'm not saying it doesn't work. All I'm saying is we can't say, yeah, well, the research says do more volume over time, so that's why we ramp it up over 6 weeks. Like, well, no, we're talking about maybe 6 years, So the volume relationship, that's the first thing. Like the volume relationship is, from the research, is much more of a long-term basis. So that's criticism one. Also, alongside that, the volume relationship appears to be more of a bell curve. So there appears to be more of a drop-off at the extreme ends of the curve. So the volume past like 30 to 40 sets, for example, it's less clear that you're still getting a great deal of benefit. There's certainly diminishing returns, but it's less clear that you're actually getting a benefit. All right, so that's the first criticism. Volume progression is important over the course of your training life, sure, but that could be 10 to 20 years. Is it important over the course of 6 weeks? It might be. But the criticism is that is not what the research is currently saying. That's the criticism. So again, if you're listening to this at home and you're thinking, well, it works for me, then cool. And all I'm saying is, from a research perspective, it's not what the research shows. So it's a misapplication of the research to say we should then use that research to progress it over 6 weeks. That's all I'm saying. We have to be careful about stuff like that. Criticism two, like hypertrophy is not linear. This was proven in a study by Cody Horn, where they showed varying levels of hypertrophy progression during the training cycle as opposed to after the training cycle, based on different factors. So hypertrophy doesn't happen linearly. Like you're not always continuously growing. You have periods of time where you grow, you stall, you grow, you stall. It's not a linear progression. Therefore, linear increases in set volume make no sense in this context, and they can lead to the overly high volumes, which can lead to worse growth. Think back to the bell curve. Okay, so if you're just ramping the hell out of the volume but your muscles are not keeping up, then you could be leading to worse growth by the end, not better growth. So it's the second criticism. Next thing is progressions to max volume, so going from say 12 sets to 20 sets or 24 sets over the course of your training cycle, they might not only be unnecessary, but it might be suboptimal from a injury standpoint. So while you can do, say, let's say 20 sets and get away with it, you might not need to for maximum growth, because again, think bell curve, right? Think injury concerns. If you go over to say 20 sets or 22 sets and you get hurt, let's say you normally hang out at about 12 to 15, but let's say you want to try this whole progressive load strategy and you end up with 18 to 20 sets by the end of your block. That is going to provide that much more damaging loading onto your ligaments, onto your tendons, way more. It's going to expose you to that level of injury. Now, I can just say anecdotally, and this doesn't mean much, but take it from an old guy who still lifts, that I have found less strain doing static loading than I have doing years of progressive loading, because I've done the progressive loading strategies for years, and I do feel it's contributed to some injuries. So that is worth bearing in mind. There's only one thing that's going to really halt your training. It's going to be like injuries. They are pretty bad. All right, next thing is criticism 4. So the idea that we should push volume over the course of a training block rather than intensity, we should push both. It kind of hinges on this concept, this idea that's brought forward to say that intensity progression doesn't lead to muscle growth. But I don't think there's enough evidence for us to say that. So there's no evidence, there's a lack of evidence to suggest that reducing the volume alongside increasing the load, like general linear cycles, are suboptimal for growth. Like your typical powerlifting cycle will have you doing 12s at the beginning, then 10s, then 8s, then 3s, and then singles, right? Over the course of, say, 12 weeks. Like a typical Ed Cohen peaking cycle. You guys know what I'm talking about. There's no evidence to say that's bad for growth. Like the old school powerlifters, they didn't look small. You know, like Ed Cohen didn't seem to have an issue with being big. Kurt Kowalski didn't seem to have an issue with being big. A lot of these natural powerlifters didn't have an issue with being big. So there's a lack of evidence to support the idea that the traditional model of strength, hyperstrength growth, so it is going from a higher volume, a higher base to a lower base and higher intensities, higher weights, is actually suboptimal for growth. So I don't think we can say the volume approach is better just because volume is better. Again, going back to the previous criticisms, volume over a lifetime, sure, but volume over 6 weeks, the relationship is not as clear. So you're starting to see, guys, as you work through this, it's really, while it might work, like the actual evidence for it is really quite sketchy. So there might be stuff we've not studied yet, but as it is. So an alternative model. This is essentially what I have come to do now. I generally don't push a progressive volume strategy anymore with my clients or with myself. What I tend to do now is I evaluate over the course of a number of blocks, and then I might increase the volume load over the course of a block. Well, after a block, if I deem it necessary. So as you guys know, if you don't, then if you're new to the channel, then I generally promote a block system of training where we'll train hard for a series of weeks, then we'll do a deload. During that deload, we evaluate it. And during the course of the evaluation, it might come up that there are factors which mean it would be worthwhile actually increasing some sets for the next block. And that's how I run it. But I'm very, very hesitant at doing that because you can run into a wall very, very quickly. So going from, say, if you're already doing 15 sets, next block 17, next block 19, well, within 3 months, you're already knocking on 20's door. And so where do you go from there? So I think at the end of every block, I would evaluate it, and it's going to be based on the previous 6 weeks of work, how well you adapted to volume, whether you actually grew from it, and is it necessary to add more volume in? Also, it's going to be different for different body parts. So I'll give you a great example of this is, let's take chest volume. Okay, with a lot of people that I've coached, their chest needs more direct volume because they get a lot of tricep work from their chest pressing. I'm similar as well. So in that instance, what we might do is increase the chest volume, but do it via chest isolation work like flies and cable crossovers, things like that, rather than just blankly increasing chest volume. And then we might not need to increase tricep volume because it's getting enough from the chest pressing. So you've got to this is why this evaluation is really important. And this is why it's important not to just blanket increase everything. So I think that can lead to overuse injuries and can lead to injury, which I think is probably contributed to me being more injured in the past. I much prefer these days static loading parameters. So over the course of, say, 6 blocks, you'll do a static amount of volume, then you'll evaluate it. If it's necessary for 1 or 2 areas, you might pump it up a little bit. If not, that's fine as well, as long as you progressed. So you do what you need to progress, but you leave sufficient time to actually evaluate your training before you move on, before you change things. That makes sense to me. I think that's reasonable, right, guys? So leave sufficient amount of time, which is about, say, 6 weeks or so, to actually evaluate what you've done and see some growth or see some strength increases, and then make changes based on that. That's the point of my video. Hopefully you guys find that useful. Let me know what you think, because it is quite a hot topic, but that's my hot take on it. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there is a link in the description down below. All right, guys, take it easy.